Frozen German Shepherd rescued by a farmer. What happens next will astonish you. What would you do if a storm forced a life or death decision upon you? On a freezing winter night, a lone German shepherd, frozen and barely clinging to life, appeared at the edge of Jacob Hansen's remote farm. As the snowstorm raged and hope seemed to slip away, the farmer made a choice that would change both of their lives forever. What followed was a heartwarming story of resilience, trust, and an unbreakable bond. The wind howled mercilessly across Hansen Farm, its icy fingers clawing at every corner of the aging barn. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, burying the frozen fields and obscuring the horizon. Inside, Jacob Hansen sat hunched over in his kitchen, the dim glow of a single oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows across the wooden walls. The old farmer, his face lined with years of labor and loss, cradled a cup of lukewarm coffee. His hands trembled slightly, the bitter cold seeping into the house despite the steady blaze in the fireplace. He glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight, another restless night. Since his wife Margaret's passing 2 winters ago, sleep had become a distant memory, replaced by the quiet ache of solitude. He was just about to head to bed when a faint sound caught his attention. At first, it was barely distinguishable from the wail of the storm. But then it came again, scratching, desperate, deliberate. Jacob stiffened, his senses sharpening. That wasn't the wind. Setting his mug down, he pulled on his thick wool coat and grabbed a flashlight from the counter. His boots creaked against the wooden floor as he moved toward the back door. The moment he stepped outside, the icy wind bit into his skin, but now the sound was clearer. A pitiful, whimpering cry mixed with frantic scratching. Jacob swung the flashlight beam toward the barn, his chest tightening at the thought of a helpless creature trapped in the storm. Cursing under his breath, he trudged through the knee-deep snow, the cold biting through his gloves as he wrestled the barn doors open. The dim light from a single hanging bulb flickered overhead, casting weak shadows across the space. Jacob scanned the barn, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. And then he saw it. Huddled in the far corner, barely visible against the snow-covered hay bales, was a dog, a German shepherd. Its body trembled violently, its fur matted with ice and dirt. Its ribs jutted out sharply, and its ears drooped as though even the weight of the storm had crushed its spirit. Jacob's heart clenched. "Well, aren't you a sight?" he murmured, his voice low and soothing as he stepped forward. The dog flinched at first, its amber eyes wide with fear. But it didn't run. It couldn't. The poor creature was too weak to stand, its paws raw and bleeding from its journey through the ice. Kneeling slowly to avoid startling it, Jacob extended a gloved hand. "Easy now," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air. The dog sniffed weakly at his hand before lowering its head, a silent gesture of surrender. Jacob shrugged off his coat, wrapping it around the shivering animal and lifting it into his arms. It weighed less than he expected. Its frame, though large, was painfully light. "You're coming with me, boy," Jacob whispered, his voice cracking slightly as he felt the faint tremor of the dog's shallow breathing. The storm fought against him as he carried the dog back to the house, the snow biting at his face and his boots slipping on the icy path. By the time he reached the porch, his arms burned from the effort, but he didn't stop. Inside, the warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the blizzard outside. Jacob placed the dog gently on an old quilt near the fireplace, his hands fumbling to tuck the edges around its frail body. "There we go. Let's warm you up a bit," he said, more to himself than the animal. The dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting Jacob's gaze with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude before closing again. Jacob moved quickly, fetching a bowl of lukewarm water and an old towel. Kneeling beside the dog, he began to rub its fur, melting the ice that clung stubbornly to its coat. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire and the soft murmurs of Jacob's voice as he reassured the animal. "You're safe now," he said. "No one's going to hurt you here." The dog stirred slightly under his touch, its tail giving the faintest of twitches. Jacob allowed himself a small smile. "There's some fight in you after all," he said, his tone laced with admiration. As he worked, he noticed scars along the dog's back and legs, marks that spoke of a harsh and painful life. Whoever had owned this animal before had not been kind. The hours passed slowly as Jacob nursed the dog back to some semblance of stability. He offered it scraps of boiled chicken and broth, which it lapped up weakly, its tongue barely moving. Watching the dog struggle to eat, Jacob felt a pang of sorrow and anger. Sorrow for the creature's suffering, and anger at whoever had abandoned it to the merciless elements. "You're a fighter," Jacob said softly, stroking the dog's head as it began to drift into a restless sleep. "That deserves a name, doesn't it?" He paused, studying the animal's face. "Bruno," he decided after a moment. "Yeah, you look like a Bruno. Strong name for a strong boy." As dawn broke, the storm began to subside, the howling winds replaced by an eerie stillness. The world outside was buried under a thick blanket of snow, but inside the farmhouse, warmth and life had been restored. Jacob sat in his chair by the fire, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Bruno lay curled on the quilt, his breathing steady now, his body finally at rest. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt a flicker of hope. The dog's presence filled the house with something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: a sense of purpose, a reason to get through another day. As he watched Bruno sleep, Jacob made a silent vow. He didn't know where the dog had come from or what horrors it had endured, but he would do everything in his power to ensure that Bruno never suffered again. Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke through the storm clouds, painting the snowy fields with a soft golden hue. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and Jacob allowed himself to smile, knowing that despite the cold, something new and unexpected had begun. Bruno's recovery began slowly, each day revealing more about the depth of his resilience and the scars of his past. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape blanketed in pristine snow, but Jacob's focus remained inside the farmhouse, where the German shepherd lay bundled near the fireplace. By the second morning, Bruno managed to lift his head, his amber eyes scanning the room with cautious curiosity. Jacob, who had just returned from feeding the livestock, knelt beside him, his calloused hands gentle as they rested on the dog's bony frame. "There you are," he said softly, smiling as Bruno's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. The bond between man and dog grew with each passing hour, forged through shared silence and simple acts of care. Jacob made it his mission to coax strength back into Bruno's frail body, preparing bowls of broth and finely shredded meat, which the dog ate with a hunger that spoke of long weeks of deprivation. Each meal was a small victory, each wag of Bruno's tail a reminder that life, no matter how battered, could find its way back. Jacob marveled at the dog's spirit, but he also couldn't ignore the occasional flinch when he moved too quickly, or the way Bruno's eyes darted nervously at loud noises. The scars on his body told a story Jacob didn't yet fully understand, but he knew enough to tread carefully. One cold evening, as the fire crackled and the room filled with the scent of simmering stew, Jacob found himself talking to Bruno as if the dog could answer. "This place gets mighty quiet," he said, sitting back in his chair and watching the dog, who was now lying with his head on his paws. His ears perked slightly. "Margaret always hated the winters here, said they were too long, too lonely." He chuckled softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "Guess she was right." Bruno's eyes followed the sound of Jacob's voice, a flicker of understanding in their depths that made the farmer pause. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, you showing up here, it's almost like she sent you. She always had a soft spot for strays." The days began to fall into a rhythm. Jacob would tend to his chores in the morning, trudging through the snow to feed the chickens and check on the cows, while Bruno rested in the warmth of the house. By the time Jacob returned, the dog would be waiting by the door, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. It wasn't long before Bruno started following Jacob outside, his steps still shaky but more confident with each passing day. Jacob took care to let Bruno set the pace, never pushing him too far or too fast. The sight of the dog sniffing at the snow, his nose lifted to catch the crisp winter air, brought a smile to Jacob's face. On one particularly clear morning, Jacob decided to tackle the task of clearing the snow from the barn roof. It was a dangerous job, the icy rungs of the ladder groaning under his weight as he climbed. Bruno stood at the base, his gaze fixed upward, his ears flicking nervously at every creak and crack. "Don't look so worried," Jacob called down, his breath visible in the cold air. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive." But as he shoveled the heavy snow off the edge, the ladder shifted slightly and Jacob's heart jumped. He steadied himself quickly, but the momentary slip didn't go unnoticed. Bruno let out a sharp bark, his body tense as he paced below, and Jacob couldn't help but chuckle. All right, I'll be careful, boss." As the weeks went by, Bruno's strength returned, and with it, his personality began to emerge. He was intelligent, that much was clear, but also fiercely loyal. Jacob noticed how Bruno shadowed him, whether inside the house or out in the fields. The dog had taken to patrolling the property, barking at distant shadows and chasing off the occasional stray animal. One evening, Jacob found him herding the chickens back into their coop, his movements precise and instinctual. "Well, look at you," Jacob said, leaning against the fence with a grin. "You're earning your keep already." But there were moments when Bruno's past crept through the cracks. He had nightmares sometimes, his body twitching and his breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. Jacob would wake to the sound of low whimpers, finding Bruno curled tightly in his corner, his eyes darting wildly even as he woke. Jacob would sit beside him, speaking in low, soothing tones until the tension ebbed from the dog's body. "Whoever did this to you," Jacob muttered one night, his hand resting gently on Bruno's head, "they'll never get the chance to do it again. I promise you that." Winter wore on, but inside the farmhouse, there was warmth and life. Jacob's neighbors, who rarely saw him outside of town meetings or the occasional supply run, began to notice the change in him. At the general store, old friends commented on how his eyes seemed brighter, how his shoulders no longer sagged with the weight of grief. When asked about it, Jacob would simply shrug and say, "Got myself a new farmhand. Keeps me on my toes." Then one crisp afternoon, as Jacob was chopping wood near the barn, he noticed Bruno grow still, his ears pricking forward and his body tense. Jacob followed the dog's gaze to the end of the driveway, where a figure was approaching, bundled in a heavy coat and moving with purpose. Bruno's growl was low and warning, his body stepping protectively in front of Jacob as the man came closer. "Afternoon," the stranger called, his voice carrying over the snow-covered ground. Jacob straightened, his hand tightening on the axe handle. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone wary. The man stopped a few yards away, his eyes narrowing as he took in Bruno. "That's my dog," he said flatly, pointing a gloved finger at the German Shepherd. "Been looking for him for weeks." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He glanced at Bruno, who had lowered his body into a defensive crouch, his growl deepening. "That's so," Jacob said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Funny, you didn't seem too concerned when he was half dead in my barn." The man's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward, but Bruno barked sharply, his teeth bared. Jacob placed a hand on the dog's back, feeling the taut muscles beneath his fur. "I don't know who you are," Jacob said evenly, "but Bruno here isn't going anywhere." The stranger hesitated, his gaze shifting between Jacob and the snarling dog. After a tense moment, he muttered something under his breath and turned back down the driveway, his retreating figure swallowed by the snow. Jacob let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and knelt beside Bruno, scratching behind his ears. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Good boy." That night, as the fire crackled and Bruno slept soundly at Jacob's feet, the farmer allowed himself to relax. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. Whatever storms lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He and Bruno would face them together. The encounter with the stranger lingered in Jacob's mind, the man's sharp words echoing long after his silhouette had vanished into the snowstorm. Bruno had remained restless for hours after, pacing the farmhouse with his ears pinned back and his tail low. Jacob had watched him closely, his heart heavy with unease. The way Bruno had bristled at the man's presence told Jacob everything he needed to know. This wasn't a simple reunion of a lost dog and his owner. No, something far darker lay buried in Bruno's past. Morning broke slowly over the farm, the pale winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-draped fields. Jacob found Bruno lying by the front door, his amber eyes alert and fixed on the horizon, as if he were waiting for the stranger to return. Jacob crouched beside him, resting a hand on his head. "You still thinking about him?" he asked softly. Bruno's ears flicked in response, but he didn't look away. Jacob sighed, his breath visible in the cold air of the room. "Me too." The morning chores did little to distract Jacob. He shoveled snow from the pathways, fed the chickens, and checked the barn for signs of wear, all while keeping an eye on the road leading to his property. Bruno was never far from his side, his watchful gaze scanning the horizon as they worked. By mid-afternoon, Jacob had decided he needed answers. Whoever the man was, he wasn't coming back just to talk. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Bruno's life had been far from kind before he had shown up, frozen and desperate, at the barn door. Jacob called his closest neighbor, an elderly man named Walter who lived a few miles away. Walter had been around long enough to know most of the town's stories, including the ones people didn't like to tell. "I might need a favor," Jacob began, cradling the phone between his shoulder and ear as he stirred a pot of soup on the stove. Bruno lay nearby, his ears perking up at the sound of Jacob's voice. "Anything for you, Jake?" Walter replied, his gravelly voice warm and steady. "What's on your mind?" Jacob hesitated, glancing down at Bruno. "Found myself a dog a few weeks back," he said finally. "Big shepherd, been through hell by the looks of him. Some fella came by yesterday, said the dog was his." Walter let out a low hum of consideration. "Did he have proof?" "Numbered just his word." "Well, that's not much, is it?" Walter paused before adding, "You think he's trouble?" Jacob nodded, even though Walter couldn't see him. "Yeah, I do. I'd appreciate it if you could ask around, see if anyone knows a man looking for a shepherd. Might give me an idea of what I'm dealing with." Walter agreed, and as Jacob hung up, he felt a flicker of relief knowing he wasn't entirely alone in this. He turned back to the stove, ladling some broth into a bowl and setting it down for Bruno. "You've got friends now," Jacob said with a faint smile. Bruno sniffed the bowl before lapping at it, his wary eyes softening slightly. 2 days passed without incident, though the weight of the man's claim lingered in the air, like a storm waiting to break. On the third morning, Jacob's phone rang just as he was finishing his coffee. It was Walter. "Jake, I asked around like you said," he began, his tone unusually grim. "Turns out there's a man staying at the motel near the highway. Been asking about a missing German shepherd. Said the dog ran off during a storm. But I've heard some things too. Folks say he's got a temper. Not the kind to keep a dog for companionship, if you catch my meaning." Jacob felt his stomach tighten. "You think he hurt him?" Walter hesitated, the silence on the line heavy. "I don't know, but I wouldn't take chances. If that dog ended up on your doorstep, it's because he was running from something. Sounds to me like that man might be it." Jacob thanked Walter and hung up, his mind racing. He looked down at Bruno, who had been watching him intently, as if sensing the tension. "Guess we've got some decisions to make, huh, boy?" he muttered. That afternoon, Jacob took Bruno out to the barn. The wind had picked up again, sweeping across the fields in icy gusts. But Bruno moved with a confidence that had been absent just weeks before. He sniffed at the hay bales, his tail wagging faintly as Jacob set to work repairing a loose beam. "You're getting back to yourself," Jacob said with a hint of pride. "Whoever that man was, he didn't break you." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jacob heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on snow. His head snapped up, and he saw a familiar figure stepping out of a beat-up truck parked at the edge of the driveway. It was the stranger, his coat pulled tight against the wind, his expression hard and determined. Bruno froze, his body lowering into a tense crouch as a growl rumbled deep in his throat. Jacob stepped in front of the dog, his hand resting on the axe leaning against the barn wall. "You're trespassing," he called out, his voice steady but firm. The man smirked, taking a few steps closer. "I'm just here for my dog," he said, his tone dripping with false civility. "Don't want no trouble." Jacob's grip tightened on the axe. "Funny," he replied. "Dog doesn't seem to want to go with you." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. "Look, old man, I don't know what kind of sob story you've made up in your head, but that's my property. You don't get to keep him." Jacob took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Property? That what you call him? Because from where I'm standing, he looks like a living, breathing creature who's more scared of you than this blizzard." The man opened his mouth to retort, but Bruno's sudden bark cut him off. The German shepherd stepped out from behind Jacob, his hackles raised, his teeth bared in a snarl that made the hair on the back of Jacob's neck stand up. The stranger faltered, his bravado crumbling under Bruno's piercing glare. "You see that?" Jacob said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "That's a dog who's finally learned what it means to be safe. And I'll be damned if I let you take that from him." The man hesitated for a moment longer before muttering a curse under his breath and retreating to his truck. "This ain't over," he growled before slamming the door and peeling out of the driveway. Jacob watched the truck disappear down the road, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He looked down at Bruno, who was still standing protectively at his side, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "Good boy," Jacob murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You did good." As the evening settled over the farm, Jacob and Bruno returned to the house, the tension of the encounter giving way to a quiet sense of victory. They had faced the shadows of Bruno's past together, and for the first time, it felt as though they had truly left them behind. Winter began to loosen its icy grip on the Hansen farm, though remnants of snow still clung stubbornly to the fields. The days grew longer, the sun cutting through the cold with the faint promise of spring. For Jacob and Bruno, life settled into a steady rhythm, one that seemed almost too peaceful given the storm, both literal and figurative, they had weathered in recent weeks. The encounter with the stranger had left its mark on Jacob's mind, but the man had not returned, and Bruno's lingering wariness eventually softened into a quiet confidence. Jacob woke each morning to the sound of Bruno's nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. The dog had taken to sleeping near the foot of the bed, his watchful presence a comfort to Jacob in a way he hadn't realized he needed. After Margaret's passing, mornings had been the hardest, empty spaces and deafening silence greeting him at every turn. But now as Bruno stretched and greeted him with a wagging tail and an eager nuzzle, those empty spaces felt just a little less hollow. Their days were filled with quiet productivity. Jacob worked the fields preparing for the coming planting season, while Bruno accompanied him everywhere, his sharp eyes always scanning the horizon. The dog had a remarkable intuition for the rhythms of the farm. He herded the chickens back to their coop without prompting, barked sharply to alert Jacob of a stray fox near the barn, and even seemed to understand when Jacob needed quiet company, sitting patiently by his side as they rested on the porch. Neighbors who rarely saw Jacob outside of supply runs began to notice the transformation. One crisp morning, as Jacob loaded sacks of seed into his truck at the general store, old Mr. Reed ambled over, leaning heavily on his cane. "Haven't seen you this lively in years, Jake," Reed remarked, his tone light but laced with curiosity. "What's the secret?" Jacob glanced at Bruno, who sat in the truck bed, his ears perked and his tongue lolling happily. "Just found myself some good company," Jacob said with a faint smile, patting the dog on the head before climbing into the driver's seat. He left before Reed could press further, but the truth lingered in Jacob's mind as he drove home. It wasn't just good company, it was purpose, a reason to move forward. Bruno had filled a space Jacob hadn't, even known was still empty, breathing life back into a farm and a heart that had long been quiet. As the days stretched into weeks, Bruno's playful side began to emerge. One afternoon, as Jacob repaired the fence along the back pasture, Bruno bounded through the melting snow with an energy that made Jacob laugh out loud for the first time in years. The dog dropped a branch at Jacob's feet, his tail wagging furiously, and barked as if issuing a challenge. "You want me to throw that, do you?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with amusement. He picked up the stick, testing its weight, and flung it across the field. Bruno took off like a shot, his legs strong and sure, the joy in his movement infectious. Moments like these became a daily ritual. Each time Jacob threw the stick, Bruno would return with an enthusiasm that never waned, his eyes shining with gratitude. It was in these small acts, these shared moments of unspoken understanding, that Jacob realized just how deeply the bond between them had grown. It wasn't just that Bruno needed Jacob. Jacob needed Bruno just as much. The thawing snow revealed the scars winter had left on the farm. Jacob spent long hours repairing damage, from patching the barn roof to fixing broken irrigation lines. Bruno was never far from his side, his presence a steadying force. One afternoon, as Jacob worked to clear debris from a frozen stream, disaster nearly struck. The icy ground beneath him gave way suddenly, sending him tumbling into the frigid water. The shock of the cold stole his breath, and the swift current pulled at his legs as he struggled to find his footing. Before panic could fully take hold, Bruno appeared on the bank, barking furiously. The dog's eyes locked onto Jacob's, and without hesitation, he leapt into the stream. Bruno paddled against the current with powerful strokes, his jaws closing around the sleeve of Jacob's coat. With a strength that belied his lean frame, Bruno pulled, guiding Jacob toward the shore. When Jacob finally hauled himself onto the bank, gasping and shivering, Bruno stood over him, his fur soaked and his chest heaving. Jacob sat up slowly, his teeth chattering as he looked into the dog's steady gaze. You saved me," he managed, his voice trembling with cold and emotion. Bruno leaned in, pressing his wet nose against Jacob's cheek as if to say, "Of course I did." Jacob wrapped his arms around the dog, his gratitude flowing as freely as the water that had nearly claimed him. "Good boy," he whispered hoarsely. "Good boy." Word of Bruno's heroics spread quickly after Jacob recounted the story to Walter during their weekly phone call. It wasn't long before neighbors began stopping by, curious to meet the dog who had not only survived against all odds, but had become a guardian of sorts for Jacob. The once quiet farmstead saw more visitors in a month than it had in the past year, each one leaving with a story about the remarkable German shepherd who seemed to embody loyalty and resilience. As spring drew nearer, the farm came alive with the sounds of birds returning and the soft rustle of new growth. Jacob and Bruno spent their evenings on the porch, watching the world slowly awaken. The sunsets seemed warmer, the air sweeter, and the silence no longer oppressive. Bruno would rest his head on Jacob's knee, his body relaxed and his eyes half closed, and Jacob would sit quietly, his hand absently stroking the dog's fur. It was during one of these evenings that Jacob found himself reflecting on the journey they had shared. "You know, Bruno," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "when Margaret passed, I didn't think I'd find a reason to keep going. The days felt empty, but then you showed up, half dead and scared out of your wits, and you gave me something I didn't know I needed." Bruno's ears twitched, and he let out a soft huff, his tail thumping lightly against the wooden porch. Jacob smiled, his heart swelling with a gratitude he couldn't fully put into words. The stars began to emerge, their light faint against the deepening dusk. Jacob leaned back in his chair, his hand resting gently on Bruno's head. For the first time in years, he felt not just hope, but peace, a quiet certainty that no matter what lay ahead, he wouldn't face it alone. Together, he and Bruno had weathered the coldest of winters, and now as spring unfurled its promise of renewal, they were ready to embrace whatever came next. Spring arrived in a burst of color, the once frozen fields surrounding Jacob Hansen's farm transforming into lush green pastures speckled with wildflowers. The air carried the earthy scent of thawing soil, and birdsong filled the mornings, their melodies weaving hope into the fabric of each new day. For Jacob and Bruno, life had become a quiet rhythm of work and companionship. Together they tended the land, mended fences, and watched the world awaken. The scars of winter, both on the farm and in their hearts, were beginning to heal. Bruno had become a fixture in the small farming community, his story spreading through neighbors and shopkeepers alike. At the general store, Jacob was often stopped by curious strangers, eager to meet the German shepherd who had survived the harshest of storms and saved his owner's life. "You've got a special one there, Jake," Walter had remarked during one of his visits. Jacob could only nod, his hand resting on Bruno's head as the dog sat beside him, his tail wagging gently. Special didn't even begin to cover it. As the weeks passed, Bruno's transformation was undeniable. His coat, once dull and matted, now shone in the sunlight, and his body had filled out with strength and vitality. His amber eyes sparkled with intelligence and trust, a stark contrast to the haunted look they'd held when Jacob had first found him. But more than that, Bruno had brought life back into Jacob's home. The farmhouse, which had felt like a tomb after Margaret's passing, now pulsed with energy and warmth. The sound of Bruno's paws on the wooden floors, his playful barks echoing through the halls, had replaced the oppressive silence. One breezy afternoon, as Jacob repaired the irrigation system in the backfield, Bruno roamed the property, his nose twitching as he explored the fresh scents carried on the wind. Jacob watched him from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. The dog moved with a confidence that spoke of freedom, his every step a testament to the resilience that had carried him through unimaginable hardship. "You're a survivor, boy," Jacob muttered to himself, his voice tinged with admiration. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jacob called Bruno over. The dog bounded toward him, his tail wagging furiously, a stick clamped proudly in his jaws. Jacob laughed, shaking his head. "You and that stick," he said, taking it from Bruno and tossing it toward the barn. Bruno sprinted after it, his legs a blur as he darted through the field. It was a simple moment, but it felt profound, a reminder of how far they had both come. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Jacob sat in his favorite chair, a steaming cup of tea in hand. Bruno lay stretched out on the rug, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Jacob found himself reflecting on the twists of fate that had brought them together. It had been months since the stranger had appeared, claiming Bruno as his own. Though the man had not returned, the memory of his sneer and the fear in Bruno's eyes still lingered in Jacob's mind. He had no doubt that Bruno had suffered greatly under the man's care, but the dog's spirit had proven unbreakable. "You saved me as much as I saved you," Jacob said quietly, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers. Bruno's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and he lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jacob's. The dog let out a soft huff, as if agreeing, before resting his head on his paws once more. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that promised possibility. Jacob and Bruno set out to the south pasture, where Jacob planned to repair a section of the fence that had been damaged by the winter storms. The work was tedious but satisfying, and Bruno kept close, sniffing at the ground and occasionally barking at a distant rabbit or bird. Jacob was nearly finished with the repairs when disaster struck. As he tightened the final section of wire, the post he leaned against shifted unexpectedly, sending him tumbling backward into the grass. A sharp pain shot through his leg, and he realized with a sinking feeling that he'd twisted his ankle badly. He tried to stand, but the pain was too great, and he collapsed back onto the ground with a groan. Bruno was at his side in an instant, his ears flattened and his eyes filled with concern. "It's okay, boy," Jacob said through gritted teeth, though his voice wavered. "I just need a minute." But as he sat there, clutching his ankle, he realized the situation was worse than he'd thought. The farm was vast, and the house was too far to reach without help. Jacob looked at Bruno, who was standing over him, his body tense with worry. An idea struck him. "Bruno," he said, his tone firm but calm, "go get help." He pointed toward the house, hoping the dog would understand. Bruno tilted his head, his ears twitching, and then he barked sharply as if to say, "I've got it." Without hesitation, he took off across the field, his powerful legs carrying him toward the farmhouse. Jacob watched him go, his chest tight with both hope and fear. Minutes felt like hours as he sat there, the sun climbing higher in the sky. But then in the distance, he saw Bruno returning, and his heart leapt. The dog wasn't alone. Walter was with him, hurrying across the field with a first aid kit in hand. "You really have got yourself a smart one," Walter said as he knelt beside Jacob, inspecting the injury. Bruno stood nearby, his tongue lolling as he watched, his tail wagging slightly. "Ran up to my porch barking like mad. Took me a second to figure out what he wanted, but he wouldn't stop until I followed him." With Walter's help, Jacob was able to hobble back to the house, Bruno never leaving his side. That night, as Jacob sat with his leg propped up and a blanket draped over his shoulders, he looked down at Bruno, who was curled up at his feet. "You're something else. You know that?" Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. Bruno lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jacob's with an intensity that spoke of understanding. The days that followed were slower, Jacob forced to rest while his ankle healed. Bruno took it upon himself to patrol the farm, his sharp barks echoing across the fields as he chased off anything that dared venture too close. Neighbors stopped by to check on Jacob, often bringing food or supplies, and without fail, they left with a story about Bruno's unwavering loyalty. As spring gave way to summer, the farm flourished, the fields bursting with life. Jacob and Bruno walked the property each evening, the warm breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and freshly turned earth. The past, with all its pain and hardship, felt like a distant memory, replaced by the quiet joy of the present. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob sat on the porch with Bruno by his side. The dog rested his head on Jacob's knee, his eyes half closed, and Jacob ran a hand through his thick fur. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Jacob murmured. Bruno let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping softly against the porch. Together, they watched the sky fade from gold to indigo, a sense of peace settling over them. In that moment, Jacob knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that neither time nor hardship could break.